Okay, so now I'm very pleased to invite Jonathan Lassard for the third keynote of the day. Jonathan comes from Concordia University, Montreal, Canada, and he will present us the use of natural language interaction for gamification and serious gaming. So welcome again.
Merci, thank you. Bonjour, thank you organizers to have invited me. That's great, thanks for being here. I know it's late and it's very warm, so I'll try to make this as fun and quick as possible. So I'm an associate professor in game design at Concordia University, and I'm not situated in serious games per se, although I imagine that any discoveries in game design in general can be immediately of use for serious game designers after that. So the thing I'm going to propose to you is to talk to you a little bit about my work on natural language interaction. So and I think the last speaker, I think, offers me actually a good step to talk of that. So I have my research group called the Lab, because it was focused mostly on conversation, now diverging to emergent storytelling and social simulation. The methodology is based on research creation, so the idea is to make a hypothesis and then try it in a game, see what works, and then learn from it, and then usually it leads to some other question that leads to another game and a bunch of academic papers as well. The talk is split in two things. You can use natural language to let players talk to your game, but you can also use natural language to talk differently to the players, so that will be the split. So for context, in many games, you have many opportunities for customization. For example, in this case, I can really choose between 10 different mustaches for my character, and so I have some agency on the characterization. And then, these are typical role-playing games, for example, and then I have many choices on the abilities that my character will have, and so I'm really customizing and making it my own. However, when it comes to conversation, it looks like this often. So you meet someone, you're in your own character, and then you have to choose between 3 items, and that's okay. I mean, all games work like this, so it's not a problem. It leaves a lot of power to designers to control the flow of the narrative. But for players, the downside is that you don't have so much agency to come up with your own answer. So you have an idea of what your character should be saying or what you would want your character to be saying at this point, but you have 3 choices. When you imagine the spectrum of human conversation, then that's a very, very small choice. So this is why I was thinking of the last presentation. I think the solution is perfectly suitable, but it could be interesting also to offer space for players to come up with their own answers. When we talk to someone in reality, if someone says something to us, we have to imagine an answer. We can't just select. And when we select, we have the answers in front of us, so the cognitive charge is definitely not the same. And we have a precedent for this. It's not even new technology. Many people might know here from even 1965, Eliza was one of the first chatbot that was a very clever and simple piece of software that essentially turned human input into questions, and it felt like a psychologist. And it was surprisingly engaging. The researcher was surprised by how this simple thing could really feel like a conversation. This is an actual excerpt from the time. And definitely speaking with bots or characters, virtual characters is getting more common and more sophisticated. And so people are more used to it. It's a possibility. And I'm always surprised. When I started working on this, I expected this to boom into games, like this is going to happen. I'm always surprised that it's actually very not prevalent, and so there's opportunity there. So my question is, how can a conversation be a game? If I'm going to make a game out of a conversation, and how do we do that? So I came up with a first prototype with a very simple context. So I chose the Snow White folktale because most people are at least aware of it, so it needs very little explanation. And you get into the game in a very specific point of the folktale where you're the evil stepmother disguised as an old woman who comes to Snow White's door and offers an apple, which is poison, and she wants Snow White to eat the apple to kill her. And her motivation is that she wants to be the most beautiful woman in the world. So you know that, you just go there, you're the old woman, or the stepmother disguised as an old woman. And what I like with this situation is I never understood why would Snow White eat that apple. She knows someone's out to kill her, and a stranger comes to her door and offers her food. It seems like there are some red flags there. But here I'm prompting the player, okay, how would you convince Snow White? Just do it. What words will you use? So it opens the play space for the player. But how would you design this, game designer? So it's a puzzle. What kind of a puzzle is it? What are the pieces of the puzzle? So here, you have an objective. You have to reach a state of affairs through dialogue. Someone doesn't want to do what you want them to do, and you have to convince them. And then the dialogue moves are made via free text input instead of choices, but that can also work for a choice-based game, by the way. And then you have feedback, which is what the character says to you. It gives you a sense of whether you're moving forward or not. And then how do you design that? So I can skip quickly over this, but I get inspired from this researcher who has a model of what's an argumentation. Because an argumentation is a very special mode of conversation for which there's no script. Every time you want to convince someone of something, it's a new situation, or else it would be solved already. So you have to come up with arguments. And typically, it's a matter of a conflict in beliefs and desires from the two parties, and you need to ideally resolve it by balancing these. Anyways, just a note. So what I do is I make this game. You have to convince Snow White. I put it on the net in game portals. Anybody can play it. And I get quite a lot of playthroughs, which shows me a little bit of how people are engaging with this. And yeah, I can look at the logs of how people interact. And then it shows how people interact. For example, in black, you have Snow White. Excuse me, but I don't understand who you are and what you're doing here. And so the player says, I just wanted to see if you wanted this fresh, juicy apple. So here, this is a good conversational move. The apple is very good, so maybe you create a desire for it. So you get a bit more of trust. It does look fresh and juicy too. I've heard your stepmother is around here and wanted to warn you. So this is a clever player who wants to create complicity by saying, I know about the stepmother thing, so I'm not the stepmother, obviously, which is a double bluff in a sense. So thanks, but I know my stepmother's plans to assassinate me, but Snow White still picks up a little bit of trust through the process. Trying to kill you, such a sweet girl, what a hag. You are so understanding. So here, trust building as well by being complicit. I would like to punch your stepmother in the head. So that's a pretty direct approach, but still Snow White likes that. Like, yeah, that feels like you're my friend. So you would really do that? Thank you. So what I noticed through all these logs is that at first I was a bit wary that I'm asking a lot of the players to type in all these texts instead of just selecting them. But what I noticed is that players actually really liked that space, and many of them engaged and were very creative, playing in character and being very creative in the approaches. And so I thought, okay, that leads me to the next prototype. I'm like, okay, I can use player creativity, whereas in typical dialogue systems, I can't because I'm only providing content and they select content. Here I can get content. So my next question is, can I foster player creativity? So that's a weird one. So same interface, but different situation. You're in the antiquity, and so the player is told that they've met some kind of divinity, and they have to convert that guy to their new divinity. So the guy here has almost no content. All he does is ask questions, like, what's the name of that god? What do I have to do? What will I get from it? Blah, blah, blah. And the player just invents everything. And then what you can do with natural language is also pick up some of the propositions from the player and then throw them back in another context, and that creates a great moment of complicity between the player and the character. So it sets up like a comedy duo where the character is like the straight man of the comedy duo who just sets up the context for the player making the punchline. And you see that a lot in the logs. For example, Will Star Trek want some building for its worship? So in this case, Star Trek is obviously a concept provided by the player, so their god is called Star Trek. And the player answers, yeah, maybe a pop-up bar in a gift shop. I find that pretty funny. So, and then the bot says, of course, yeah, of course. But what will this pop-up look like? Here's this little error, the pop-up should be pop-up bar. Everyone will wear a costume and buy overpriced drinks. It will be the best experience of their lives. More original than the usual pyramid. So here the punchline lands, and you get a little moment where player and bot kind of make some fun together. And it was so funny that I opened a Twitter account where I posted some of the good punchlines that happened through the interaction. So for example, how does Silver String relate to the other gods then? It probably met them at a conference once. Will the university become a sacred place? No, the university is becoming a temple of neoliberalism. And then the bot says, oh, that's too bad. And the player says, yeah, sorry. What will post-structuralism do to those who refuse to adore it? It will find them in their Tumblr feeds and confuse them terribly. Anyways, I find this funny. But here the players are doing this all on their own, like they have no public. They're just having fun alone with the bot. So it shows how strong this conversation can be. So this led me to another intuition that I had, is that in games, many of times NPCs, the players, the characters are used as information signposts. The player needs to know stuff about the game and the world, and so characters are there to just deliver. And typically that's a non-problem. You just ask questions and you get the answer. So I'm thinking, oh, with my new thing, I can maybe make this more complicated and possibly more fun or interesting. So how can I gamify information retrieval by making it more complicated than clear? So that's how game design works. You make things that work perfectly fine. You take things that work perfectly fine and make them uselessly complicated for fun. So this game is also quite strange, but the situation is knowledgeable again. I don't want to over-explain the world. I want things to go fast. So this is the end of Hamlet, and everybody's dead already. Many people die in that play, and they're all back there in their tombs. And you're the person who needs to find out who killed who and for what and why. You need to write the report. And so the only person you can talk to is the gravedigger, and he knows all the answers, but he's stupid. And so you have to ask questions to really dig the information out of him. I'll give you an example. So for example, how did Ophelia die? You need to know that for your report. He says, she stopped breathing. That was a very bad idea. So that's person being way too literal with the question. Why did she stop breathing? How am I supposed to know why people do things? I wasn't there when it happened. Okay, so where did she die? Well, I imagine it was in the cold water she was immersed in. What water? Well, sure, she was immersed in the river. Can't be immersed in a cup of water. So here you go. You have the information. She drowned in the river. You can move forward with some of the other characters. So these are my three prototypes with this system. One thing that I want to mention very quickly is that it's much easier than it might look like. This is really not rocket science. Some of my assistants on this were not programmers at all, but I could train them in the chat script language within a day or two, and they would get together. There's a lot of convenience. For example, if I want to know if someone's talking to me about food, I don't need to list out all the possible things they might say, steak, apple, whatever, but I can use ontologies, which are banks of synonyms. So, okay, he's talking about food. And I can even capture what they were talking about. If someone says, do you like steak? I don't know that they said steak, but I know they said food, and then I can say, oh, you really like steak? And the bot doesn't actually know, he just says back. So anyways, just so that it's not so hard. And so some conclusions. The good is that it broadens the play space for interactive conversations. It allows for role-playing, really at a conversational level. It allows players to contribute new content to the fiction, which is almost unheard of in games. And it allows nonlinear conversation. So that might not seem obvious, but with choice-based things, the problem is since if you missed the opportunity to say something, you might never go back to that moment where you have that choice. And that's very irritating. If you play games, you know that feeling. Whereas in a natural conversation, I can always go back normally and say, you remember that moment you mentioned chocolate? Yes, I would like some now, even though we were talking about something else. But in many games, you can't do that. The chocolate is past now. But there's a lot of bad as well, so that might be a reason why you don't see all these games all that much. For example, here's a log where everything goes wrong. Have your stepmother ever tried to kill a dwarf? I don't have any stepmothers. So that's a big problem, because that totally kills the drama, the plot here, where the plot is there's a stepmother, she wants to kill Snow White. But here, this is an automated answer, and that just says back and says, I don't have. Pardon me, so this is the player saying, please tell me what's happening. I hate to be rude, but there's an awful lot to do in this house. Okay, so who's trying to kill you? My stepmother wants to kill me so that she can claim to be the most beautiful living woman. But you just told me that you don't have a stepmother. How do I know that? So Snow White is terribly confused here. Did you take your medications today, my child? Then she says, I guess that makes sense. So here the conversation is kind of repaired because Snow White admits that she has lapses of conversation, of confusion. So part of the design, the knowledge that we can get from that is, well, there will always be some flakiness, there will always be some errors, even when you talk to Siri or some very high-grade bot, many times they won't understand what you want to say. So we need to design for that. We won't avoid it. One inspiration that I get is from Janet Murray here, classic. And she says it's important that you script the interactor. So you script your bot, but you must also explain to the person interacting what's their role. And the order, and it's not scripting in the sense that you have to do this, it's a seduction. This is how you can play along with me so that we can both have fun. And if there are ways to do this, a clear and constrained domain, this is about Snow White. So if you talk to me about the last hockey game, don't expect me to have an answer. I won't. It's a clear and constrained role. This is what you want to do. A clear objective and clear progress feedback. And when you do this well, you hardly need your bot to work at all. So here, I found a log once that I looked at it because it was surprisingly long. It was like 50 pages long. And in that game, at some point, the player can just exhaust all the possible answers, and they just get a generic answer that says, I have to go now, or something like that. And the player continued playing for 20 pages just because they were in the flow of talking to this person, even though there was no actual answers, but they wanted to continue. So if you script the interactor, that helps. You can also justify the errors by putting the character that it makes sense that this character might make errors. So the typical approach, there aren't many natural language playing games, but there are a handful maybe. The most prominent one is Event Zero over there. And most of these games, the chat is you talk with an AI or a bot, so it's already understood that it's an artificial intelligence, and this will explain all the errors. In my approach, I've done a different approach, is you talk to idiots, and that's both funny, and also it explains why they don't understand everything. So anyways, you have other ways to deal with errors, but the idea is to know that you will have errors and try to use them to keep the conversation rolling rather than it being a showstopper. And what I've noticed is that many game designers are worried about players getting out of immersion, the famous word, because, for example, they get a mistake, an error. But like what we saw with the other log with Snow White, is players can get out, but they'll get in back, and that's it. If your game is seductive enough, they'll play with the bot, they'll try to break it, they'll insult it, they do that a lot. But then at some point they're like, yeah, okay, I know this is a bot, but I still want to win the game. So they go back and then they play in character. So this is fine, it's totally fine. So just a few things about NLP for output, which might be maybe less applied for you, but one thing that I noticed with that last prototype is that this character, the Undertaker, is an interface. Conceptually, that guy is the interface to the world. There's nothing else in the game that communicates the world except talking to that guy. So that inspired me, and I conceptualized this as a subjective interface. You understand the world through the point of view of someone, of a character. And that opens many interesting possibilities for complicating things for the player. So I wanted to play with this. And I'm imagining it a gameplay of subjective interfaces, for example, making sense of reality from contradicting sources, which we all do, understanding your interlocutor's positionality. So if this person is this kind of guy, what he's going to tell me is different from what that other person is going to say. Understanding and dealing with distributed agency. What I mean by that is, if I ask someone to do something for me, there might be an error, or I might have surprises in the actual implementation of that action. Relying on others, in other words, politics. So my idea, the small pitch for that game was, imagine a city simulation. Like in SimCity, you have advisors. They're kind of a side note to the game, and they mostly act as a tutorial for new players. But imagine if you only had that. There are only the advisors. And everything you know from what's happening in the city comes through these people, and everything you can do on the city goes through these people. So here they act as objectively a subjective interface between you and the city. So going back to NLP, natural language a little bit, is immediately it raises a problem, which is how do I get the characters to express their subjective interface on a game world that is varying? Because it's not a script. If I have a city, the player might make these decisions or these decisions. These things can happen. So you have a dynamic world, and I can't write all the answers for all the possible states of that world. So that was a puzzle for me. How am I going to do that? So I discovered from speaking to people in conferences, which is useful, about context-free grammars. And I won't go back too much into details, but the idea is that you can write out lines that some portions of the lines are not decided yet. They'll be decided later and being replaced by other possible lines. So that's interesting because it can be generative. You can make many variations, but you can also control the flow. So here I was using James Ryan's expressionist, where it's not only a context-free grammar, but the flow can be controlled by saying, it will go to that node only if this variable is true. So the characters can not only say varying things, but they will also say true things, which in the context of the system, which is important. So anyways, the game I made there is a remake of the first city simulation that was documented, is Hammurabi 1968. And what I liked about that is that it's a very simple city simulation. You're Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, and the antique city, and there are 3 resources: grain, land, and, well, I forget now. But anyways, imagine a city, it's just 3 resources, so it made a very simple case. And so we made this game where you have 3 advisors, and you have an agriculture department, or ministry, a territory ministry, and a welfare ministry, and then you have to allocate your ministers to one of these ministries, and then give them a budget. As a player, that's all you do. But the problem is these guys, they misrepresent what's happening because they want to be king instead of you. So they keep lying to you and so to get favor, and you have to deal with bad information. It's very difficult, and you get overthrown all the time. But it makes the city, it twists the city building game in an interesting way. Okay, so just concluding with my current work, just to point at it, I've kind of upped the scale, now that I know how to do this, is I'm generating and describing a whole world and its history. So the quick pitch is imagine The Sims, but for a full society. I don't have 3D representation, so this is where text generation is useful. I describe what's happening in that society through generated text. So this is my goal with this is to emphasize the discovery of emergent stories. So that's my interest there. Anyways, but in the meantime, to do this, I use the technique of text generation. But I made now that I wanted to do a lot of it, we made our own plugin that would be generative, adaptive, and accessible. And a little bit like my previous interlocutor, to me it's really important that the authoring tools are simple, because that's key to getting good content quickly. And if you have to rely on programmers to put in content, especially narrative content, you're in trouble. So you want people to, with our system, Blabber, I can train someone in literally 30 minutes, and they're up and going. So it's just a text file. For example, in this case, is there a pointer on this? Yeah. So for example, this would be an input line, an output line. Hey, this is just to, oops, this is just to say that, and I can expose a variable here. I don't even know who right now who that person will be, but at runtime, I will know that. So character.name landed in Montreal, and he or she is health status. And I don't know that yet. It's not resolved, so I go to health status. If the character health is larger than 50, and then it goes here, which goes here, and then I can say it will vary between he's doing well, he's doing all right, he is in one piece, so you can vary and create variation. It's completely recursive, so I can have other non-terminals which are expanded, 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 expanded. But that's all there is to it, and you can do tons of stuff with that. Almost done. For example, my author here, he's not a programmer, but he picked up on this and has a lot of fun. And this is his grammar that generates animals in our world with way too many details. For example, so the spoogle is a green-plumed elephantine of mischievous tendency, well known for their bone product. But also, in another generation, the spoogle is an average-sized bizarre critter of exuberant disposition. And these are really easy to do. It's actually it's very fun just to make these grammars. The spoogle is a red, long-necked quadruped, used mainly as draft animal. Their main means of sustenance is fruit. Anyways, so we have fun with that. So the game right now looks like this. It's a full world with people in it. Every single person is simulated. Their whole life history is simulated. And the fun part, or what I want to be fun, is that it auto-generates a Wikipedia of the world that you can totally explore, and all the text is generated depending on the simulation information. So like this is Rosie Thinkhole. She was last seen at par right. If I click on par right, I get the page of this place, who lives there, what it looks like, what's the vegetation going there. And it's a lot of information, I have to say. And then I can go to every year of her life and see what she did. So she went to a feast, and then she had a baby, and then she met someone, and all these people I can click on and get all the information from there. And right now it doesn't look like it, but you can discover some pretty funny stories in there. Okay, so going back to gamification, once again, I'm not an expert. What I do is lay that here in case it can be interesting. But through these projects, it often happened that the people I talked to had ideas. So I'm reporting some of them. So there's the idea of making information retrieval playful. So if you want people to look for information, but it's just a database, and why would people care about that information? A rule of game design is, if it's hard to get, it's interesting. And that's simple. So even if your information might be not so exciting per se, if the way to get there is complicated, it might become fun. Second language education, especially the chatbots, they can recognize, for example, errors and still understand and propose corrections. And also it's a non-anxious way of talking, because the person doesn't judge whether you're talking well or not. It just gives you answers, understands or not. Political simulations, training for social encounters, so that's a little bit the same, but any social anxiety can be alleviated by talking to chatbots as a training. Understanding the perspective of others. And there's also a question of open-ended, if, of course, you secure your data and get the consent. Data collection and citizen science, because it's not only, if you want crowdsourcing information, here you can actually get prompts from players or from users. So it doesn't have to be, do you prefer A, B, or C? It's just, what do you prefer? And then you get maybe answers that you were not expecting and looking for. So that can be useful. Or even for data labeling for deep learning and stuff like that. Voila, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this rich and very dynamic presentation. And we still have 5 minutes for question, not more. So 3 question, 4 question. Okay, it's easier for me.
Okay, how complex is an NLP mechanism that you have behind it?
So for the chatbots, I was using ChatScript, which is an open language for designing chats. It's still available and maintained. I find it pretty good. The problem is if you don't want to do English, it's really baked in to understand, for example, misspellings and the ontology. So that's one of the issues I had. So making the chat itself is not very complicated, but it's just text. On top of it, the interface was made in Unity, but that's just a front end. So what it does is it picks up the input, sends it, it's a server actually, sends it to the chat server, gets back a text, and shows it. That's it. That's how simple it can get. And all the sources are online if anybody is curious. I'm not all that proud of the code in there, but it's there.
Many thanks, Jonathan. Really great talk. I was wondering, are you aware about this Chinese chatbot that is from like a couple of years ago, and it seems to be that there is something like 100 or 200 millions Chinese people using it daily, and seems to be then something like 1 or 2% of this population believe that they are more or less in love with the chatbot. It's more or less like the movie. I don't know if you've seen Her, a great movie by the way. But it seems to be that what you see in the movie is already her head.
Yeah. Its conversation is so natural to us, and it's easy to project. I mean, the lesson here is that players do all the work, almost. They do. You propose something, and then players will generate and engage, those who want, engage with it and do all the work, even if the bot is not reliable or whatever. In their mind, they'll find an explanation, and they'll justify it. So yeah, I'm not surprised. I think I heard of that one. I don't know how sophisticated it is or not, but it just shows that there's an appetite for that. It's maybe sad news about the loneliness of people, but also it offers some comfort. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that's tricky. I don't know. I don't collect the IP addresses, so to me it's all anonymous. But it would be easy. For example, when we're developing, someone said maybe Snow White could just ask, "What's your social insurance number?" just in case some people answer. And that might happen, you know. Anyways, but people talk a lot, say many personal things when you read into that stuff. They can be very impolite with the chatbots, that's for sure. Yeah, they feel completely free.
Another question? It's okay. Good.
All right.
Thank you again, Jonathan.
You're welcome. Thank you.